Hey everyone, and this is the next episode of our Engineer Your Career series. If you're new here, lovely to see you. Thank you for joining us. My name is Jess, and I'm the sales lead here at Showcode to look after everything sales related, funnily enough. So account management, dealing with new clients, and all of that. Bazam. So I'm not actually a tech person, but I do very much work in the industry. Today I'm joined by the lovely Maggie, who will do her own amazing introduction very shortly when I hand over. For those of you who are new to Showcode, not heard of us before, just to explain, Showcode is a community platform for coders where you can build, share, learn and compete, and with the aim to hopefully get hired, or if you're not looking for a new job opportunity, you can still work on your skills and so on for when that opportunity or that your circumstances may change. If you're not already done so, you can create your Showcode profile via showcode.io. You can see the link here, but I will post it in the chat very shortly. And you can take part in various coding challenges. We do hackathons. We've got our amazing communities on there, such as Athena for women and non-binaries in tech, Varsity Code for students. And we've also started onboarding a lot of university computer societies as well. So if you are a student who is part of a computer society, please do get in touch with us, as we'd be more than happy to get your community onboarded so you've got a home to go to. But that's enough of me talking. You're not really here for me, you're more here for Maggie, who's going to be doing talking about tech for newbies, hopefully helping you to demystify a lot of the jargon that you may be experiencing or about to experience as you enter into the tech world. So Maggie, I will hand over to you. I'll put myself on mute and hide myself. Anything that people want to put in the chat, please feel free to do so. I will be monitoring it, and obviously we'll come back to you with any questions at the end of the session. Thank you so much, Maggie. Oh, that didn't work. Oh, here we go. One second, just having some technical Wi-Fi problems. There we go. I was about to hand over the room. I was like, oh no, don't leave me like that.
Yeah, I was just so over it. Yeah.
A webinar about tech, and yeah, the Wi-Fi is not working. Just you couldn't make it really. But yeah, I'll hand over to you. Thank you so much. If you have internet problems, just a heads up, everyone. There is a few Wi-Fi problems on Maggie's side, but hopefully we'll be able to make it through the session. Or potentially not. I'm hoping Maggie will be able to reconnect very shortly. She has been having a few problems, so just bear with us. In the meantime, what I'll do, guys, is I'm just going to post in the chat the different links that I just mentioned regarding the Showcode platform. Any questions, do feel free to send them my way. Oh, here we go. Right.
Hotspot now.
Okay, there we go. Yeah. I'll hand over. I'll mute myself now, and hopefully we'll get through the next sort of 20 minutes, half hour or so.
Yeah. But then you're like, no, I'm hotspotting now. It's frustrating because I had just had the Wi-Fi fixed. But hello everyone. I'm Maggie. I'm going to share some slides actually just to remind me what I'm meant to be saying. But lovely to be here, and yeah, I'll introduce myself, I guess, in due course. So I, as it's on the screen, Maggie Hunt. I'm a software engineer at PA Consulting, and the theme of our webinar today is Tech for Newbies, which is the handle of the blog series I run, and I think was quite a good summary of the gist of what we're going to talk about today. So as you can hopefully see on the screen, we're going to kind of cover journeying into tech, and I will go into a little bit why that's so important to me in a moment. Straight from sort of your first steps to finding a role to how to actually, I guess, survive as a software engineer or in any technical role, really. And a big theme is going to be sort of demystifying the jargon around it. And that is the sort of the aim of the whole sort of Tech for Newbies theme, which I will go into. So swiftly moving on. So as I said, I'm a software engineer. I'm also a consultant focusing on the private sector, specifically sort of consumer goods and also the financial services sector as well. And I'm also a career changer, hence the passion for sort of upskilling and introducing people to the world of tech. So when I graduated, I actually studied languages at university, and I mean sort of spoken languages, not coding languages. And I really, I knew I loved working with people. I knew I loved talking. And so immediately went into a recruitment role, which I did love and was learning a lot. But it soon became apparent that the sort of nerdy bit of my brain wasn't being engaged at all. So I learned to code. And especially over lockdown, when I was on furlough, really got into it. And then since I've been working at PA as a client-facing, hence the consulting software engineer, and general tech consultant as well. The joy of being a consultant is you get thrown onto almost anything and everything. So I've had a really good level of exposure to sort of cloud strategy and cyber stuff and all these kind of other things, which I will go into. But that's a little bit of background about me, how I'm here, why I'm here, and also what the point of Tech for Newbies is. It's just making that jargon accessible, because actually one of the things that really enabled me to get into tech was leaning on experts to explain and demystify the industry for me. So as I said, there are sort of going to be 5 different sections. The very first is going to be a half, I guess, is going to be about getting into tech. And then the second half is going to be sort of, how to survive once you've got there and demystifying the jargon around it. So I would say the first steps of getting into any technical role are, well, I guess learning about the tech, right? You want to build skills, and you also want to prove yourself to yourself as well as others. And by building skills, I don't just mean sort of learning for the sake of it. I mean, you really need to identify your strengths. You want to not be starting from scratch. You want to be using what you're already using. You really need to adopt a growth mindset. You really need to be ready to learn from mistakes, learn from failures, and seeing them all as learning opportunities rather than failures. And really add those to kind of your arsenal, and really try everything you can and be prepared for sometimes it not to work out, and that be part of the learning experience. Linked to that, I think exploring just as much as you can, learning as much as you can, seeing what there is out there is really important. And again, goes hand in hand with, sometimes it not working out, because realistically you want to try so much that you're getting a clear idea of what your strengths are and what your interests are out off the back of that. In terms of proving yourself, now I know that can be scary, and I don't mean that in a scary sense. I mean, it's almost giving yourself evidence, really. So you want to complete training, you want to learn, you want to learn in a sort of a structured way. You've got to learn things that are going to be useful. But I think what is really valuable is obtaining certifications. And I don't mean that, your first cloud certification is going to suddenly make you the world's best cloud engineer, or make you ready to immediately go off on your own and work on tech projects. But it is really good evidence to yourself to bolster your confidence, and also to future employers of your commitment to learning more and to the direction that you're ultimately going in. Further to that, I would really encourage you to publish any projects that you do as part of your learning. It's really good to, some people have a personal website, some people use LinkedIn, some people use websites like GitHub, which I'll go into in a bit of detail later. But you really want to share the things you're proud of, the things you're working on, your success stories as well, just to help you, connect with people, show people what you're about, and also show people that this is something that you are really keen on learning more about and are fully committed to. So that's step 1, or well, steps 1A and B. I think the next section is really about building on that. Personal development and building those bridges are really key to leveling up from the curiosity to the actual doing. And there are 2 sides to this. You want to learn from others, and you also want to build your own sort of brand and sense of self. In terms of learning, and again, this never ends. This never ends, no matter what stage of your career you're in. I don't just mean sort of studying, taking courses and classes, learning from people, reaching out to people who are experts and also who are upskilling in the area, developing projects with people, so working on hackathons or group projects as part of your courses. It's just, you don't know what you don't know. It's really important to reach out to as many people as possible and just tell them, I'm interested in this and I really want to learn about it. Ask questions, learn from them, and, use events and LinkedIn and online forums to connect with people who are interested in that area as well. Because as I said, you don't know what you don't know. And the best way to find that out is not by Googling something you think you should know about, but by asking people who work in your area of interest what you should know and what you should understand and where you might fit in. Off the back of that, you will end up building your brand. And this is a bit of a marketing term. It's definitely something from consulting. But you want to be known for what you're trying to do, because that will help you build a reputation. It will help you win work or get jobs. And having just a sort of a cohesive sense of where you're going will really help people help you on your journey. I've put a few sort of, I guess, sound bites on the screen here. You really want to do all of them. You know, it's all about raising your profile, and you can do this by engaging with people, growing your network, attending events. Someone I really admire in the FS industry describes it as building your tribe. So accumulating friends and connections who will support you, who will encourage you, who are going in the same direction or on the same mission is really important. And you can do this by sharing, you know, your success, your skills, your interests, just building that kind of network around you. It is impossible to underestimate the positive impact that the network I have had on my career and on pretty much anyone's, just in terms of putting me in touch with opportunities and helping me meet people and learn things from them. It's really, really crucial to leveling up on that journey into tech or any other new industry. So you know what you're doing, you want to find your role. What roles are there? And the answer is obviously infinite. I think I've brain dumped maybe 15 on here, roughly. It is definitely not an exhaustive list. But the good thing is you don't actually need to, you know, code, for example, to do all of them. A lot of the tech I talk about is coding. And as you'll see, the roles on the left is sort of highly technical. I want to highlight the difference between a few. So web development versus programming. I describe programming as the sort of the hardcore code that makes stuff happen. Doesn't necessarily affect how things look. Web development is web specific. And there are so many other kinds of coding roles off the back of this. You know, you can build mobile apps. DevOps as well involves a fair bit of code, developing AI. And actually, if you move over towards the right, you can see there's a lot of roles where you are talking about tech, handling tech, having an understanding of how it works really matters. But actually, the material of what you're doing day to day is less technical. Automation, for example, you can use a lot of low-code tools, so it's a lot more drag and drop. Sustainability is a big growth area as well in terms of people's interest. You need to understand how the tech works, to research it, to assess risk, to manage the project, to design it, to make it more accessible, and also to sell it and market it. There are so many roles out there where you are working in tech. You do not have to be sitting in front of a computer coding if you don't want to. And I think what's also important is that if that is, you know, what you want to do, it's important that you know there are other options out there just so you can be sure. Which leads me actually on to, okay, fine, you know there are so many roles out there, but how do you identify what you want to do? And there are a few things you want to take into consideration. Your transferable skills are going to be critical. It helps if you can avoid starting from ground zero and use the skills you already have, be that marketing skills, presentation skills, your ability to build a rapport with a client. You also want to use your new skills. There's no point in taking a new job where, you know, if you want to code, you're not coding. You want it to combine your interests. So say there's a particular industry you're interested in, financial services being mine, for example. You really want to make sure you're still using all that knowledge you already have. And you want to make sure the working environment is going to be right. It will be a really tricky transition if you're also taking it to extremes, moving country or moving industry, or maybe you're used to being in the office all the time and all of a sudden it's 100% working remotely, or vice versa. There are two golden rules that I really, really would emphasize here. Don't try to do too many new things at once, I think is number one. And again, kind of tying all that together, it will be really tricky to successfully change career if you're not only trying to build your new skills, but also trying to change into a completely different industry or line of work. Some of the most successful career changes I've seen have been when people have, if they've already been a consultant, they've stayed in a client-facing role, or vice versa. Leading from that, though, the second golden rule is just make sure you definitely want to do it. Again, no point in changing career into something that's going to be a bit of a false start. You know, just because you've identified that what you currently want to do isn't what you want to do, doesn't mean that the first option is going to be the right one. And your future self will thank you for spending maybe a couple of extra months exploring your options than taking the first thing that comes. It is so frustrating for everyone involved if you end up taking a role and actually it doesn't end up right for you and you have to go back to square one. So really, really, if you are looking to move into tech, try to limit how much you're learning at once to just the tech skills, and make sure that the tech skills that you're learning are exactly what you want to do. Because whether it's data science, security, whatever it is, if you fundamentally don't want to do it, you won't be motivated to learn, and then you'll end up stagnating and it will just be a bit of heartbreak for everyone involved. that felt a bit doom and gloom. We're going to move on now to the sort of the actual kind of tech for newbies kind of side, which is obviously very exciting. And, you know, at this point, you're here, you've got your new job. How do you integrate? How do you cope with all this new lingo that's being thrown at you? So I'm going to talk you through what a typical day in the life of a software engineer, specifically me, so a client-facing software engineer, might look like. And then I'm going to go into a bit more detail about the things that I've brought up on screen. So a typical day will, and you know, it can happen at whatever time, but a typical day will likely kick off with a stand-up meeting with your team, where you will go through what you're working on, what you might work on next. You'll probably then log off that meeting, do a little bit of coding, and then you might call a colleague up and do a bit of pair programming. Once you've finished what you're working on, you will want to submit it, and that will go through a code review. And then at the end of this sort of journey, could well be on the same day, you will end up demoing. So you will end up demonstrating to your client or to your team what is going on, what you've completed, in order to show off and present it, and also take any questions. That was a lot of jargon, and I promise it's going to get even more jargonier, which is definitely a phrase. So let's, I guess, stand up is probably the first thing I said, and that is a component of the Agile approach to managing projects. Now, Agile is a project management framework. It's an approach to managing projects, and it is incredibly popular when it comes to software development. I've not met a software developer ever who has not at least worked in an Agile way at some point. And the building blocks of it are really the point of it is breaking everything down into manageable and agile, responsive kind of chunks. I'm going to start for the smallest. So the smallest building blocks of this are the tickets. And the ticket is, imagine a post-it note on a board or a job advert. The tickets are virtual post-its with little jobs that need doing written on them. And so the way you work is you will pick up those tickets, you will take one on, and you'll say, I'm going to deliver this ticket. I'm going to work on this ticket this week. The way these are allocated is in the meetings with your team and the stand-ups, which is what I referenced earlier. Most people do these daily, but they're essentially regular check-ins to make sure everyone's working okay, everyone's delivering what they need to, nobody's got any problems or blockers, and you know, everyone has enough work. The way that all of this is kind of orchestrated is that it's broken down into sprints, and sprints are usually a fortnight of time where you'll have certain goals set for every kind of thing that you want to achieve in that sprint, and that will obviously be a certain number of tickets that you will take on, which are part of bigger and bigger, and it just keeps scaling and scaling into the ultimate sort of scaled agile framework. At the end of each sort of chunk, it'll sometimes be called a program increment, sometimes it'll just be quarterly or maybe monthly. You will do a retrospective with your team where you reflect on how everything's gone. But the important thing to remember is essentially the agile ways of working are to communicate a lot, be responsive to any new kind of requirements from the business and so on, and that you have stand-ups every day with your team to make sure that work is going well. So we've covered stand-ups, and that approach will follow you throughout your technical career, no matter what you're doing. Pair programming is the next piece I mentioned. And actually, I'm going to delve just into a little bit into what it's like to just code for your day job. Pair programming is the first piece I mentioned, and that is basically what it says on the tin. So the way it works is, in tech, most people work remote quite a lot. So usually you won't be there next to each other. So usually it'll be sharing a screen over a call where one of you will be coding and the other person will be sort of contributing verbally. You'll be working on the code together in a pair, hence pair programming. So that is a really good sort of collaborative kind of approach. A lot of people will do it if they want to sense check what they're doing or if they're working through a problem. The other two things I want to talk about are a lot more kind of technical than that concept. Firstly, front end and back end. And actually, programming, technically, a lot of people would bucket into back end, which is why I wanted to talk about it here. But when you're coding, you could be coding anything. You could be building a website, an app, the software for a car, AI. The difference between front end and back end fundamentally is front end tends to be a bit more creative, I would say. Back end is pure cold hard logic. Which is a really clumsy way of putting that. Front end is essentially sort of what you see, the visual piece, and back end is what's going on, you know, behind the scenes. If you were coding a car, the front end would be the color it is, when the indicators turn on, how aerodynamic is. The back end would be what the engine is doing to make the car run, you know, what gear you're in, the capacity of the tank, all that jazz. Sometimes they'll impact each other. How streamlined the design is will impact how well the backend can run. But fundamentally, they are the two different ends, and most projects will have people who specialize in one or the other. You could be full stack and do both. Sometimes you will pair program with someone who has expertise in another field, because actually what you want is to sense check the overall logic or how well it integrates with what you're doing. The third thing I've put on here is what's an IDE, and that is an acronym that is thrown around and around and around, and frankly took me a good 6 months to probably 18 months to learn what it actually meant. And it's really, really very simple. It is essentially a text editor for your code. Imagine Microsoft Word versus Google Sheets, any kind of software where you're typing into, it's that for code. And there are certain ones that are designed with certain coding languages in mind. You might use IntelliJ for Java, because that is, again, designed to make Java coding easier, PyCharm for Python, or you can have Visual Studio Code, which is very much preferred by front-end developers. An IDE, it stands for Integrated Development Environment. It's essentially the screen in which you code, and you will be using it a lot more than you'll ever actually use the term, I would say. So we've covered the coding and the Agile. What's a code review? That was the next thing on the list. Git is a hugely technical topic, which I will try to summarize as, we call it source control. Imagine you're working on a common document and the computer is just working out where things slot in and where people have done things differently. So rather than have a copy that you're each working on, and then you have to manually kind of go through and work out what's different, what's changed, Git will automatically do a lot of that for you. So you only have to resolve the conflict or the bit where you and another developer have maybe done the same thing slightly differently. There are a few terms that I've listed out which are really key to understanding Git. It's so named just because of a joke, I think, originally. Branching is really key. So the way that you can work simultaneously on the same thing without messing things up is everyone does a branch, which, imagine the core of the code is a trunk. You work on a branch of it, you make your changes, and then you push what you're coding to it. You pull any updates to your computer to make sure what you're working on is the most recent version of things. But ultimately, Git is just making sure that you don't have loads and loads of different code floating around. Everyone's always reading from the same hymn sheet. A pull request is where the code review comes in. So what you will do is, if you have finished everything on your branch and you think it's ready to be part of the final product, you'll open a pull request, which is a request to pull all of your code into the main branch. And that will be where someone who's more senior or more of an expert than you will go through it, correct it, make any advice around best practice to make sure that what you're putting into the main actual code, is up to scratch, up to standard. And that will be pretty much part of every time you're closing a ticket, every time you're submitting any code, you will get someone who is more senior and more experienced than you to look at it to make sure that what you're doing is right and is aligned to the goals of the project. The final piece I mentioned is demo. And frankly, I think that's very self-explanatory. It's when you demonstrate what you're doing for this, to show what you've done. And sometimes it will be to the rest of your team. Sometimes it might be to a client. You could be demonstrating just a component. You could be demonstrating the entire program. I just wanted to collate some sort of top tips for a successful demonstration. The first one is know your audience. And that is really important because you could be presenting to some really technical people who will have really technical questions. So you want to include a lot of technical information in your demonstration. On the other hand, you could be speaking to actually some business stakeholders who don't really care what coding language you're using, as long as they can see visually what it looks like and how efficient it is. You want to speak slowly, something that I definitely am still learning to do. You've got to explain the context. Again, varying levels of technical context depending on the audience. But the two critical ones are test your tech, test that it works, test that you can screen share, test that you have the right permissions, test that, the solution you're demonstrating is working on the morning of, just in case something's been changed that you need to fix. And a final kind of tip, which is not standard practice necessarily, it's an option, is often very helpful to pre-record what you're going to show, just because that rules out the possibility of things breaking on the day, for example. And obviously people will want to know that it works in real time, but sometimes it's just more efficient to have something that is going to take X number of minutes, it works smoothly. You can even pre-record the narration alongside it too. just helps run a much smoother demo where you're demonstrating what happens without going through the stress of crossing your fingers that it will work as quickly and as well as it did when you weren't sharing screen. So you've done day one, you're a fully fledged dev. What next? How do you improve what you're doing, and how do you understand the rest of the project? How do you go beyond your first day, your first week? I've entitled this section, "The World is Your Oyster." What I really mean is you will never stop learning and you will never stop needing to know anymore. But there are 4 things I'm going to cover as what I think are the fundamental sort of need to knows in order to succeed as part of a software development team. And actually, they're all relevant, whatever your technical discipline as well. So first, we're going to look at tools. Tools and resources, I think, again, these are probably the 4 things that it's most key to understand when you first start. But frankly, this could be a never-ending list. And actually, I'm going to start at the bottom because people will often say Google is your friend. When you're Googling a coding problem, the top 3 most helpful results will always be on Stack Overflow. It is a huge forum where people post their problems and resolve things for each other. Someone I know once said that if they've ever got a problem, they put it on Stack Overflow and then they answer it in the comments wrong, just because it's such a passionate community that as soon as they see a wrong answer, you'll end up with 8 helpful and useful ones. It's a really supportive, useful resource. And the joy of it is it's very rare that, especially as a beginner, you'll ever be coding something that someone else hasn't had a problem with before. So the answer will be there and it will save your superior's time and usually be actually way more informative than anyone could give you on a 5-minute call. Moving up is Bootstrap. Bootstrap is a noun and a verb. As a verb, it kind of just means to borrow an element, strap it onto what you're doing and use the relevant bits to make it work. And that is where Bootstrap, I guess, as a concept sort of has named itself, because it is a brilliant website with a lot of different front-end components. So buttons, forms, visuals, headers that you can borrow, lift out, use in your web application. And especially if actually you're practicing things that aren't to do with what you're lifting out and actually you just need a framework to work with so you can practice your layouts or your logic or whatever. Using Bootstrap is a brilliant resource to build the visual part of your website from. Moving up, CLI. It stands for Command Line Interface, and it is essentially the bit that hackers will pull up in any film you ever see. It's that sort of black screen where you just type in words and the computer does what you say. It's the, I guess, the like functional version of sort of file browsers and stuff. You know, you can do everything, almost everything you can do on the command line just visually by clicking through the buttons and the menus as normal, but it's super efficient to use the command line. You feel like an absolute wizard when you've learned the commands, and it's just so much faster because you don't have to wait for the computer to load anything visual. And finally, the one I put at the top, because it is probably the thing that as a coder you will hear flying around the most, is APIs. It stands for Application Program Interface, and it's essentially a little bit of tech that will connect you to a database and do a lot of the thinking for you in case you want to integrate any of that information into what you're building. So, you know, you could want to connect to Spotify, you could want to connect to Google Maps. That'll be via an API. And the way it works is kind of like a librarian. Like if you go to a library, instead of having to trawl through every single book to find information on, I don't know, bee populations or bee stings, you just go up to the librarian and say, hello, I would like information on this, that, and the other. And as long as you're giving them the right information, as long as your request is configured correctly, and you've got a library card, so the permissions to access that information, the librarian will go, here you go, and come back to you with the right information within about, well, a much faster time. So an API is just a way to connect different programs and different bits of information to each other. And they are a real foundational technical piece of pretty much anything anyone will ever code. Cloud is another big one, and I like to describe it as the granddaddy of iCloud. It's kind of like a massive Dropbox for, you know, anyone and everyone, which businesses use, instead of running their own data centers. So instead of having to have a billion, well, not a billion, but thousands of different hard drives stacked on top of each other to hold all their data, to run all their computing, you can rent that space and that computing power from the big suppliers. And the main suppliers are Amazon Web Services, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud Platform, and then Alibaba Cloud, but that's predominantly in Asia. And you can use them as an individual, you can use them as a business. I've put public versus private because now what's important to understand is using public cloud does not mean your stuff is publicly accessible. It just means that the public can rent space there too. Private is you rent dedicated space. So think of it like if you're putting your stuff in storage, you rent an entire room, regardless of how much stuff you have, and you have to sort of, rent the entire room, which means no one else can use that room, even if what you're putting in there is much smaller. That would be private. That is dedicated resource just for you. Public cloud is if you go somewhere and you're like, I only need to store this file. Can I pay you for just the space for this file? You get to decide where it goes. As long as no one accesses it, I don't care where it's put. That's the difference between public and private. Essentially, the resource sharing without access being granted. There are lots of benefits to using both public and private, and I've put the 3 core ones on this slide in comparison to running your own storage, etc., on-premise or on-prem as we call it. The first one is security. It is, especially if you're dealing in all the information modern businesses are, there is a lot of pressure to keep it secure, understandably. If you're renting space from one of these established providers, they are investing a lot more in the security of that data than you ever could hope to. It's also flexible because you only pay for what you use. And so if you're, rather than having to go, oh God, we need to build an entire new data center because I've got like 3 gigabytes more of data than I can fit in this one, you just rent that extra 3 gigabytes and it's a lot cheaper. That leads me on very nicely. And also actually more than just the cheapness, it's really flexible. If you suddenly need way more computing power to run your website, if you're doing a Black Friday sale, for example, instead of having to build a data center just for that, you just rent more and it scales and it does that automatically, efficiently, and again, more cost effectively, which leads me nicely on to the last point, which is cost efficiency. You are really benefiting from the economies of scale. It's like if you're paying for your neighbor for a cup of rice when they bought the 10-kilo bag, rather than you having to buy the 10-kilo bag. So the cloud is brilliant, super flexible. These providers are always on the top of their game technically, and actually just having a basic understanding of how cloud works is a really good way to get into tech, because other than the normal interactions people have with cloud, like Dropbox, for example, people don't really have an understanding of what that is, and it is a huge enabler for a lot of the tech we use today. In terms of building software, there are a couple of things I wanted to flag, which are concepts that you will need to know and understand. The first one is testing. Never do any code without testing what you're doing. You wouldn't put a product out into the market without checking that it's not going to cause an allergic reaction or break if someone sits on it or whatever. You need to do the same for software. And people will write that there's a whole testing sort of pyramid that I am actually due to go into on my blog very soon. But all you really need to know is that you should do bits yourself, but also there are dedicated people who make a career out of testing, and you could be one of them. The next piece is DevOps, and so they're still coding, they're still the engineers, but they're holding the hands of both the developers and the operations of it, making it run. So if you're doing DevOps, you are making sure that there is enough space on the cloud to deal with it. You are probably working on the links between those resources and when they need to expand or not. It's a bit of a middleman, but still highly technical. All you really need to know as a developer is that they will look after that, but you do need to work with them. And then finally, I've put dev, test, and prod environments. Environments are, they're the virtual version of a sort of a physical environment, fine. But what you will need to understand, especially if you're coding, is you'll usually have a branch for each. So dev for development, test for testing, and prod for production. The prod environment will be where whatever that code is, that is what the customer sees. Test is what the testers use and see, and dev is sort of your final version that you're pushing your code to, when we talked about branching, when you are done with it. Imagine it like computer screens almost, or TV screens. The TV screen that's prod is what the customers are seeing and using. Test is what the testers are seeing and using, and dev is your sort of final draft, your final version. And so it's just important to understand the difference between, what gets pushed where, because at the end of the day, if you break dev, not a problem because it's not going to affect the customer. If you break prod, you're in trouble, and it better be midnight. The final piece I'm going to touch on is best practice. And again, I'm only a few years into my technical career, and I can count on one hand even the number of people who I think I've met that are experienced enough to properly lecture on this. So I'm not going to talk for very long. However, there are three things that I think personally are really, really important. The first is documentation. Now, people can make careers out of being documentation writers. However, it's still expected that as a developer, you put some kind of documentation in your code. And that is just comments to show how it's working, comments to, or maybe even documentation to say, if you're downloading this piece of software or using this API, this is how you configure it so you can use it. It's kind of like the IKEA manual, but for software, or an IKEA sort of instruction set. The next is naming conventions. And again, people have different tastes. What matters is that you're consistent in your code with the rest of your project. So if you're naming something called variables, like X in algebra, and you're capitalizing them all, you've got to capitalize them all. If you're using words in a certain order, if you're calling a class something like, I don't know, delete line class, delete row class, delete column class, you can't then have a paragraph delete class. You need to make sure it's consistent, just so if someone's joining the team, they can follow it. And if someone's cleaning up the code, they can follow it. And if someone's testing it, they can follow it. And finally, sustainability. As I said, this is an emerging area, but I would essentially say we're kind of at that point, you know, the Victorian like industrial revolution in the UK, that was very much do everything as well as possible, consume resources with no real sense of the consequence of consuming those resources. And very much digital technology growth has been in that ilk recently. We've gone paperless, fine. But we haven't really addressed the fact that every email has a CO2 emission. Every data center needs cooling and produces heat and produces emissions. Like there's all these, just because it's intangible doesn't mean it's not actually producing emissions somewhere. It's just those data centers, those cloud data centers or your computers are emitting things into the atmosphere instead. So there's recently a lot more thought going into, okay, how do we code efficiently? How do we bootstrap less, you know, because actually that is copying code and running code that is probably not part of the overall program over. How do we, you know, log things more efficiently, cache only what we need, XYZ, all these kind of approaches to just make sure your code is better for the environment or your software is better for the environment. Again, people are still learning, people are still working this out, but it is useful to bear in mind, and that, you know, there are actually materials out there now where people can start learning about that and, you know, just being a better coder, which obviously is a long way away from when you first learn to code, but is important. You know, the better you learn it at the beginning, the better you'll be overall. So that was my big old spiel about going from zero to hero in tech. Thank you very much, everyone, for your time. I guess if anyone has any questions, I would welcome them, and here I am. Thank you.
Thank you, Maggie. That was so good. You know what? I actually picked up so much myself, even though I'm in sales, which thanks for the shout out about sales also being part of tech. A lot of people don't realize there's so many other things you can do which are non-technical. But there's other bits there which I think, yeah, like no one really explains it. And then like, especially when, for me, like if I'm on a call with tech and they'll just speak, and then I'm like, fortunately, some of the team are very good at this and they pick up on things and they go, oh, this means that and this means that. But many people I've been on calls before and they just don't explain it. And you're just sort of sitting there like, right. And then they go, everyone understand? And everyone goes, yeah. And you're sitting there going, no.
Definitely guilty. I think there's a real almost like confidence gap, and it's fair enough because you're learning. But it's so easy to just get snowed under by the jargon and the terms, and then you don't want to be that person that says, hey, can you explain that thing from like yesterday? So yeah, 100%. No, I'm glad. Thank you. And yeah, sales is very much part of tech. The reason I got into tech was recruiting tech professionals and not understanding the job descriptions I was giving them, you know? So I think it's important to look wider. And as we all work with technical stuff more, every single role is going to need to have some kind of understanding. So if you're interested in it, pursue that interest to the end, because whatever role you're in, it will be useful somehow.
Definitely. We've had a question from Rachel. So how did you choose to go into coding and how did you find the right company?
Great question. So with coding, I'd always been a bit geeky. And so I just always been kind of interested in it. And the reason I actually sort of properly got into it was my company were partnering with a company, with an organization called, what were they called? Girls Who Code. And I just kind of flippantly said to a colleague, I was like, oh, that they train school children coding. I was like, oh, I wish I wish they did that for grown-ups. And this colleague happened to have done a course with Code First Girls who do it for adults. And so I was like, oh my God, amazing. Did that and really, really loved it. Loved creating websites. I felt so powerful. Just because you imagine something and then you just build it and it does it and it's incredible. And so I loved it. And I did 2 courses. And the second one was actually hosted by my current employer. And I loved the instructors, really got on with them. And they had a whole sort of women in tech movement to try and recruit more people in. And so I really vibed with the people that were teaching me. I basically just wanted to be them. And so just stayed in touch with that company through lockdown. And then when I was at risk of redundancy, talked to them more. And gradually, then I wasn't made redundant, but I ended up really just wanting to do it. And actually, I think it was that cultural fit. It was that because it was going from client-facing recruiting to consulting, there wasn't too much of a gear change apart from the actual tech of the job. Which made a huge difference, as well as the people. But yeah, I think you do kind of have to follow your gut on company vibes. But it is just amazing now because the people that were teaching me are now my friends and my line manager and people I get to work with all the time. So yeah, I think how I chose, I kind of fell into it and loved it. But how I found the right company is, again, building my network, meeting people and just talking to people and vibing with them. And ultimately, no regrets, still there.
Yeah, no, it's so important, like building those as many relationships and like connections you can make, especially in the early part. Like you should always do it, but the early part of your career, I know it can seem intimidating, but the more senior people you speak to and the more other people in your sort of like also at your level, you, as you said earlier in your talk, like having that tribe is so important. But then connecting with people outside of that who are more senior, they've all been there. So, and you'll find a few that you really get on well with, and they'll be great mentors sort of moving forward.
Yeah. And they really open doors to you. And Rachel's just commented, people make a good career. And that is so right. You know, I think as well, it's very easy to be intimidated by people who are in the sphere you want to be in. But everyone is just so excited about what they do in the tech space. Everyone is a geek that just cannot, if you ask them to talk, they will. And so actually, you know, I've never met any, I think, in all the people in the thousands of people I've reached out to since starting this journey, I reckon maybe 2 have not had time to speak to me. Everyone else has just been like so excited to share and to help. They need to build their teams. There is a talent crisis at the moment. And so actually everyone is just so keen to meet anyone who's interested to see how they could use their skills. So yeah, building that tribe, building that network, just talking to people and learning from them is so powerful. And I think a huge sort of enabler for finding what you do want to do, because there's not tons of information about all the possibilities available to you at the start. And people can, you know, people experienced that industry will chat to you and be like, hey, do you know what you'd be really good at? And that's what happens.
Yeah, no, definitely. There's like, you'll get so many insights as you're sort of navigating all your way through. And I think the open culture, that it's definitely got a lot more open now within, like, I know obviously we had lockdown and stuff, but I think that actually helped to make people talk a lot more. I think it's a huge turning point for a lot of individuals, because I think before then it was almost like this hierarchy in a lot of companies, and the juniors didn't feel like they could speak to the seniors unless it's their manager and all of that. And that kind of like just broke down all the barriers, which I think there were before.
Yeah, I agree. I think I remember reading something about it's absolutely impossible to separate your work and home life now, because even the most senior people have their kids or their dog running in or have to go and answer the door because of a package or whatever. And I think that level of authenticity has helped people build careers that are more authentic to them as well. And also, again, tech has grown and there are so many roles around it that need doing. You know, so many people are reskilling into just being more technical versions of what they were doing as well. So yeah, 100%. I think it's had its terrible, traumatic, awful moments, but for the world of work, it's opened to a lot more flexibility and upskilling for sure.
Definitely. Well, thank you so much. We haven't had any further questions. However, if anyone would like to connect with Maggie and speak directly with her, I have posted her LinkedIn in the chat. I just realised I didn't post my own one, but it's fine. You can easily find me via show code LinkedIn page. I'm the only Jess that works here. We're all just human, treat each other as equals. No, 100% Rachel. I think everyone has to be kind to each other. So if anyone else, if you have any further questions, as I said, reach out to myself or Maggie directly. Been really, really great, Maggie, having you on. I think you've broken down a lot of things that have gone over my head for many years, and I've just not really known who to ask about it. So it's always great. I love when I host these sessions and I really pick up on certain things that I've never really been taught myself. So if anyone else watching would like to know someone that would be good, we're always looking for new speakers. So please, if you know someone that would have any insights, do reach out to us. As Maggie and I were just saying, is people in tech love to talk, and I do find this is a really great platform to give people that opportunity to have a go. We're always welcoming new people all the time. So as I said, join our communities on Showcode. We've got our Athena one, and later this year we've got a big hackathon for the women and non-binary in tech community happening on the 1st of July. And then we've got a big get together on the weekend of the 30th of September, which is going to be Showcode Live, which will be the whole community coming together. There'll be lots of opportunities to speak with various employers. Maggie, obviously you definitely will get an invite. I haven't told you that one yet, but you will obviously be invited. And there'll be coding battles, career talks, workshops, and all of that going on. So definitely sign up to the platform. And I'm not going to plug it any further because I think you get the general gist of what I'm saying. But Maggie, I have to say it's been great. Thank you so much. I know we've run a bit over, guys, so we're going to let everyone go. But if you want to watch this again and come back to it, it will be on our YouTube channel very shortly. So yeah, otherwise I will see you all next week, where I'm joined by the lovely Sam Larson-Disney, who is going to be talking about how you can basically build a side hustle out of your engineering skills. So there you go. So if you want to earn some extra cash, tune into that one. As far as I'm aware, it's the same time next week. But if it changes, we'll let you know. So keep an eye out on our socials. Brilliant. Fabulous. There we go. I'll go it all out. Perfect, Maggie. I'll speak to you very, very soon. Awesome. And to everyone else, thank you so much for tuning in.
Brilliant. Thanks for having me.
Goodbye.
Bye.